My name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 4, with my co-host today, Dr. Alvaro Santana Acuna. Hello, Alvaro.
Hello, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you so much for not only inviting me for this great podcast series that you're starting. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you today. That was how they undertook the crossing of the mountains. Several friends of Jose Arcadio Buendia, young men like him, excited by the adventure, dismantled their houses and packed up along with their wives and children to head toward the land no one had promised them. Before he left, Jose Arcadio Buendia buried the spear in the courtyard and, one after the other, he cut the throats of the magnificent fighting cocks, trusting that in that way he could give some measure of peace to Prudencio Aguilar. All that Ursula took along were a trunk with her bridal clothes, a few household utensils, and the small chest with the gold pieces she had inherited from her father. They did not lay out any definitive itinerary. They simply tried to go in a direction opposite to the road to Rojaca, so that they would not leave any trace or meet any people they knew. It was an absurd journey. That is a opening, well, it's actually the middle of the second chapter, from 100 Years, our book today, 100 Years of Solitude, by the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This book is the winner of the Nobel Prize. It is a hugely powerful book, and it's a book that proves what the modern writer Nicholas Nassim Taleb has said, which is that ideas matter more than people. Events, ideas, and interpersonal interactions for leaders often align in their lives to produce outcomes that usually defy rational explanation, particularly after the fact. Leaders who are attentive to this alignment tend to succeed rather than fail, and often explain away their successes by an appeal to luck. They say, I was just lucky, or I was just fortunate. However, luck, fate, circumstance, good fortune, even this idea, if you're a religious leader, of godly favor, these are all terms used to explain what very often leaders cannot. Both success and failure seem arbitrary in a world where leaders believe in the material substrate more so than they believe in what lurks below it. When explaining leadership to others, leaders would be remiss to neglect to at least admit that something else lurks under the surface of the everyday and the mundane. Now, magical realism, and my co-host today is going to have some comments on this. Now, magical realism is a genre of literature first made famous by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as I was corrected. I think of him being made famous by Don Quixote and Miguel Cervantes, but we'll have a discussion about that in just a moment here. However, that genre extends even through our visual acuity, right? It extends through our visual lens and how we see the world, through the paintings of El Greco and my personal favorite printmaker, Francisco de Goya, and even into the works of Pablo Picasso, and of course, the work of our author today. Latin American writers and artists leverage the tropes of mythology, and I've been reading a lot about the psychology of mythology lately, and then layer them below the substrate of events and ideas and interpersonal interactions to explain the world of the unexplainable. This truly fits deeply into the canon of Western literature, and this two-step is nothing new. What is undeniable is that the works of magical realism can express, represent, and explain hard truths to leaders that may be difficult to rationally explain. These works can also serve to ground rationality and its sometimes horrible consequences in a foundation that is understandable, practical, and obvious, if a leader knows where to look. And of course, all those lessons start with a rebel colonel, a firing squad, and a memory, half remembered, of ice. In order to understand this and place this work, this magical work, winner of the Nobel Prize, as I said before, in its proper context, I would like to welcome Dr. Alvaro Santana Acuna. Dr. Acuna is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Whitman College. He wrote Ascent to Glory from Columbia University Press in 2020, the groundbreaking study of 100 Years of Solitude, from the moment Garcia Marquez first had the idea for the novel to its global consecration. And I took those words off the website. I love that term, consecration. I love that. It has religious overtones to it. Mm-hmm. Using new documents from the author's archives, Alvaro Santana Acuna shows how Garcia Marquez wrote the novel, going beyond the many legends that surround it. And this novel has legends around it. Okay, we just on a previous episode talked about the Iliad, and we talked about before that Meditations, and before that the Book of Nehemiah. These books are weighted; they have meaning. It doesn't mean they're tough to read. It just means they come with their own ballast, come with their own stuff. Along with his scholarly work, he has written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Time Magazine, among other media outlets, and is the curator of the exhibition, and I would encourage you to go and see this if you're in Austin, Texas, of the exhibition Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Making of a Global Writer, open through January 2022 at the Henry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas, just a few miles south and west of where I am today recording this podcast episode. Welcome, Alvaro.
Well, thank you again for having me, Jesan. And I really look forward to our conversation about great books. I think, there is certainly many lessons that we can learn from great books. And I think, certainly, I think one of the things that we can learn from them is their capacity to lead our lives. And, before our podcast, we're actually talking about this. I think that, I think it's a very powerful thought to consider that we are born into a world in which there are actually books that have been around for a very, very long time. And, some of them you have already talked about them. And at the same time, these books are actually not just simply there, but they have been shaping the world in which we're now living for quite a while, right? And sometimes they continue to shape our lives in ways they're direct and they're visible to us, but often they also impact our lives in ways that are really magical and mysterious.
Well, and it's hard to kind of, for leaders anyway, it's a leadership podcast, leadership lessons from the great books. So we're going to look at 100 Years of Solitude, and we're going to try to pull some leadership lessons out of this, right? It's hard for leaders who are so grounded in that material substrate, because for the last 500 years, since I think, therefore I am, we love anything we can touch. Mm-hmm. But there's so much more, and Gabriel Marquez makes this point very deeply, I think, in 100 Years of Solitude. And he really starts hitting it in about the second third of the book, which is where a chunk of our content is going to come today, because I think that's the most important for leaders. But in that second third of the book with Macondo, and kind of how that the city shifts and changes, and even I wrote this in my notes today, moves out of myth and into history. And history has a material substrate to it, but myth, that's something else altogether. And the classics can help us with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you're putting it, 100 Years of Solitude is a book that, as Garcia Marquez was writing it, he was taking it very seriously, because he knows that reality is not just hard facts and historical evidence, but there is also that another layer of how we perceive reality, which is extremely close to the mythical. And then from there, we enter the realm of the magical. And I think that one of the beauties of this book is precisely, and I think one of the reasons why it has become so influential, is because it really treats both dimensions of life, with the same fairness, right? So the magical side of things and the real side of things.
Well, and it's helpful for us as it's helpful for us as individuals who want to do better, right? Because we've got this world again that's so deep into the substrate of the material. I mean, we're recording this podcast with a mic that I got for $100 that I would have, which was a high quality mic that I would have never gotten for, I would have never gotten 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago. I would have never had this mic, right? And technology and the technologists want to convince us that the only thing of value are things we can touch. And yet our lived lives are so much more complicated than that. And even as leaders, our lived experiences are so much more complicated than that. And we need genre work to pull that apart and to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with what you're saying. I just as you may remember, the first very piece of dialogue that you see in the book is actually a quote from Melquiades, the gypsy, in which he actually says that the objects have a soul, right?
Yes.
And I think that's a very powerful first piece of dialogue to open a novel in which you can see that, and then throughout the novel we see certainly that objects do have a soul, and I think that's precisely what great books are. I like to think, since this is also a podcast about leadership, I really like to think about great books as paper leaders, see, and I think that 100 Years of Solitude is a paper leader,
Yeah. No, that's a good way of thinking. That's pretty good. I would have never thought of that. That's why I have great genius guys like you on. that way we can get things that I would have never thought of. Well, back to the book. Let's jump into that. At first, Jose Arcadio Buendia had been a kind of youthful patriarch who would give instructions for planting and advice for the raising of children and animals, and who collaborated with everyone, even in the physical work, for the welfare of the community. So he's doing what a good leader would do. He's collaborating. He's not authoritarian, top down. It's this idea, and we're going to visit more of this today, but this idea of the great father, right? The great father mythology here. Since his house from the very first had been the best in the village, the others had been built in his image and likeness. Now we're kind of, again, going back to that great father idea. It had small, well-lighted living room, a dining room in the shape of a terrace with gaily colored flowers, 2 bedrooms, a courtyard with a gigantic chestnut tree, which will be a problem later on, a well-kept garden, and a corral where goats, pigs, and hens lived in peaceful communion. The only animals that were prohibited, and not just in his house, but the entire settlement, were fighting cocks. Now, I'm not going to go, because I don't want to ruin the entire surprise for folks, go and read why he doesn't have any roosters. And when I read that, I had to go back literally and read it twice, because I was like, that's amazing. But it gets into this idea of unsettled souls, unfinished business. And it also gets into this idea of how do you articulate the imagination? And this kind of goes into my next series of comments. How do you articulate the imagination of a population? And this is what Buendia is doing. And this lesson rings out throughout the first, I would say, 2/3 of 100 Years of Solitude. Macondo, which is the town that is founded by Jose Arcadio Buendia as the great father on that journey in that first section that I talked about. The town is founded, it grows up, but it's not a town in kind of the traditional way that you would think of maybe Chicago, right?
Of course not.
Right. Most modern people are city dwellers, right? They think they try to conceptualize, and I'm going to kind of frame it in a South American context. It's not Rio de Janeiro. It's not a city in Venezuela, right? It's not a city it's not Buenos Aires, It's not those cities. It's a mythical town in a mythical place. And as Gabriel Marquez writes this, he sets up very material problems for Macondo. And even through all that, Jose Arcadio Buendia is that first great father. And like all great fathers, I put this in my notes, from Osiris to Zeus, he loses his mind. and when he does, it falls to his three sons, Arcadio, Colonel Buendia, and Jose, to use war and tyranny and revolution to try to bring back something to Macondo. And this is a very powerful mythological idea. The idea that, and it runs through religion, it runs through psychology, and it runs through leadership. It's this idea that, yes, leaders give articulation to the imagination of the population that follow them, which is what, he did as the great father. But it's also this idea that, I was just reading something today, biblical today, and it's this idea, and it really came home to me that, systems grow, they come into fruition, and then they become corrupt, and then they collapse. And it's this continuing cycle. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, which is actually the path that Macondo itself followed, right? So you are precisely correctly referring to how Macondo was this very tiny village that, thanks to, among others, the contribution of this great leader, Jose Arcadio Buendia, started to grow, to develop. Then there is this moment, this kind of the golden age. And then the city starts to collapse pretty rapidly until something happens at the end, right? So also not to give any spoilers to the listeners, but we see certainly that cycle, right? And I also want to certainly acknowledge what you're saying about all this mythology. You also mentioned the Bible. Well, I think that this is not an accident, So Garcia Marquez, like many great writers, I think there is this famous. I once heard someone who was a Shakespeare scholar saying that Shakespeare was really great at creating stuff, but he was even better at stealing people's stuff, right? So, and great masters steal.
Hey, in art school, we were told a good artist copies, but a great artist steals.
Yeah, that's right. So that's it. One of the things that Garcia Marquez does is that he's really stealing lots of ideas from the Bible. So if you want to think about it, actually, the opening of the novel it's a kind of version of the Genesis, right? In which this family and other families are basically trying to find kind of the this space on earth that will look like paradise, right?
Yeah.
And then trying run away from corruption and from violence, and just find like this peaceful Garden of Eden, right? Which Macondo is, but as you also may remember, the town is surrounded by this jungle and all this barbaric and wild nature. So that also emphasizes a lot to what extent what you're saying before is that Macondo is kind of this mythical, almost like Garden of Eden space, right?
Well, and how do you deal with snakes in the garden? Which is what happens when first the gypsies come in. You mentioned Melquiades, and that's the first kind of inclination that there might be something here. And then Marquez builds on that. He builds on that very intentionally throughout the entire novel with, or throughout the entire work. I hesitate to call it a novel. I don't want to dismiss it in that way. But he builds on it in it, with the rebellions and the revolution. When, what's his name? I have it in my notes. Hold on a second. Don Moscote. When Don Moscote comes in to impose governmental rule, that's another snake in the garden. And now you've got all these snakes in the garden coming in, and this is where the patriarch winds up going crazy underneath a chestnut tree, speaking Latin. And by the way, Latin brought to them by, and we're going to talk about religion in here too, but Latin brought to them by the father of the Catholic Church. So religion, politics, these are all seen as psychological or emotional or systems based snakes that are in that Garden of Eden.
Yeah, and which also, and as you're putting it, they kind of revert, the natural order of things, right? They, so they corrupt this kind of original spirit of the town. And and you mentioned precisely the Moscote. He arrives, and then Jose Arcadio comes to him and says, "Oh, who are you and what are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I'm actually representative of the law." And Jose Arcadio tells him, "Well, you know what? We founded this city, and no one has ever paid attention to us. So, and we have been able to govern ourselves successfully up until now. So I please ask you to leave this town, to never come back. Or if you want to stay, you are welcome to stay, but not under that role of, this kind of imposed leadership, because we have a more, organic, we have a more organic leadership that has emerged in this town." And he was certainly the leader, are in challenge, and accepted by the community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And he was, what is it? And I want to talk with you a little bit about kind of how Marquez put together the book, but like he put the very next line after that, he goes, the Don Moscote basically kind of walks away puzzled. He's like, I don't really know how to handle that. How to handle that feedback. I don't really know what to do with that. And then he like goes back and like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll build a thing here. I guess it's fine.
Yeah,
and it's sort of that shrugging. And Marquez does this several times in the book, where he'll have a character will say something mythological to a character coming from the outside. You see this several times, in particular with, and we're going to talk about Ursula as an example of female leadership too today. But you'll like see like these interactions that these characters will have outside of the garden, and the character outside of the garden winds up coming in. And to my knowledge, at least of where I've read in the book and what I've read in the book so far, to my knowledge, the only character that left the garden was the Colonel. And as he left, he became more, Marquez doesn't use this word, but it was the word that I thought of, adamantine, right? He became harder and harder, right? As he fomented revolution and rebellion from Alaska to California, which is a great line. I love that. And it's he couldn't survive in his original form of purity outside of Macondo. He just couldn't do it. He was corrupted. Again, he was corrupted by the world. That cycle.
Yeah. And I think, we're probably going to talk later on about, the solitude of power, right? And how much, leadership, leaders actually suffer from that disease of being a leader sometimes, that solitude, which he experienced from, deep inside.
Well, let's talk revolution. So, back to the book, when we talk, well, not even back to the book, like thoughts on this. So revolution. Okay. So things happen, the snake of madness is in the Garden of Eden. Sin and evil despoil everything, even the great Father. Revolution begins. Revolution is visited upon Macondo. And, it's really interesting because, the way that Marquez frames it, it's almost as if the Great Father, even as the Great Father is declining, becomes more awake, right? And then these things begin to swirl around him, and everybody ignores him. That was one of the weirder things in the novel for me, anyway. And by weirder, I just mean I hadn't encountered that in a narrative form before that baldly. That's all I mean. It was just unusual for me to see it, and his son, Colonel Buendia, begins this process of not only fomenting revolution, but then, figuring out, number one, what politics is, because at first he was like, I'm going to be an alchemist like my father. And he went down that road for a little while, but that didn't yield to him the results that he wanted. And so, he winds up in the Don's house. Not going to give too much away, but he winds up at the Don's house, and he winds up with the Don having explaining to him, and we may talk about it today, we may not, the difference between liberals and conservatives, which in our political era I thought was incredibly hilarious. I literally laughed out loud when I read it.
And I think, and I'm sure, and that's a classic line, So going to church, No, you say it. You say it.
Yeah, I literally laughed out loud. We'll get to it in a minute. I literally laughed out loud when I read it, and then from there, the Colonel goes into, okay, we're gonna have a fight, and he's kind of drawn into it, and that's one of the big lessons from the book is, and it's one of the first ones that I've got in my notes. Leaders of revolutions have to be careful. They have to be careful how they're drawn in. They have to be careful how they plan. They have to be careful what type of revolution they are going to stage. It's one of the first big lessons after, of course, giving articulation to the imagination of the populace, coming into revolution. And, Garcia Marquez is writing from the perspective of, an entire boatload of Latin American history around revolution that's a whole other podcast all by itself. But,
Yeah,
that's a whole podcast series by itself. But, from the time of, the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas all the way to now, and in particular when the Spanish showed up, bloody revolution. And at a certain point, there's too much blood on a continent's hands, and I think this is kind of what he was also getting at. Like, how do you wash all? Nietzsche infamously said, we've killed God, and there isn't enough water for us to wash the blood off of our hands. We've killed him. Like, there's just not enough. And he wasn't saying that triumphantly. He was saying that very sadly. Because once you move the great patriarch, the great father, God, however you're going to frame it in your conception, once you move that mythology out from underneath the underpinnings of society, then revolution is the only thing that's left. And the colonel, as one of those three sons, goes forth to engage in that. And it reminded me of the great line from Rod Steiger playing Juana Miranda in A Fistful of Dynamite. And this is an old school movie. Most people haven't seen it. If you haven't seen Fistful of Dynamite, go watch it. It's a Sergei Leone film. It's great. James Coburn is in it as an Irish revolutionary, and they're kind of sitting not really sitting, but they're lying together in this room and talking about revolution. And Rod Steiger says, the revolution, don't try to tell me about the revolution. I know all about revolutions and how they start. The people that read the books, they go to the people that don't read the books, the poor people, and they say, the time has come to have a change. And I don't want to talk about when I talk about revolution. So the poor people make the change. And then the people, this is the great line, this is the great part of it. The people that read the books, they all sit around the big polished table and they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And then what has happened to the poor people? They're all dead. That's your revolution. So please don't tell me about revolutions. And in economics, this is called creative destruction. We see this happening everywhere right now. And this dynamic is playing out everywhere, and leaders do not know how to navigate that dynamic. Now, in Fistful of Dynamite, the irony is, Juana Miranda, played by Rod Steiger, winds up in a revolution that he didn't want to be in. That's the irony of it. But the same thing then occurs to Colonel Buendia in 100 Years of Solitude. That was immediately what I thought, because I'm a huge movie buff too. That's immediately what I thought of when I started reading about his story. I was like, oh, this is Fistful of Dynamite. This is that other thing over here, right? And, we see this in business. New entrant comes into the market, upending the old conservative firms, and then that firm then becomes mature, and then gets upended by other upstarts. And, Schumpeter called that, creative destruction. But that's mythologized in the actions of Colonel Arcadio Buendia. And that creative destruction, when it came to Macondo, was so damaging. And as the leader, I don't think he had a clue what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't think he had a clue. And this is my larger point is leaders have to have a clue. If you're going to go do a revolution, if you're going to go start a fight, you have to have a clue.
Well, I think there was also a moment when he was disappointed.
Yeah.
On the revolution, right? So, and I think, to go back to what you're saying before about, like the evolution of the city of Macondo as a city and then declining, I think that, social movements, including revolutions, do have that moment of effervescence. And then it's like falling in love. There is a lot of energy. There is a lot of enthusiasm. There is a lot of energy, thinking that this is the right one. This is the moment where we can really fix things. And then there's a moment of distraction. Most of the time it's violent distraction. And then there is resistance, right? Or there is even worse than that. There's actually counter-revolution, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then, and counter-revolution is part of that moment of disenchantment. And I think, Aureliano Buendía experienced that, and the way that Garcia Marquez found to express that in the novel, or one of the ways in which he was able to express that, is by showing how Coronel Aureliano Buendía was increasingly a more solitary person.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also confessed to one of his closest war friends that he had kind of forgotten why they were fighting and what they were fighting for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes back to the point that you're saying, that you need to have a script, and you need to have clues about what you want to do. And I think this really plays well with the reality. And now we're kind of entering the domain of history, because you were referring to the history of Latin America. I don't think that Garcia Marquez did this by accident. I think this underneath this disenchantment, dissatisfaction of Coronel Buendía was actually the dissatisfaction of many Latin Americans with the revolutions, right?
Yeah.
I think this is actually the decade when Fidel Castro was in Cuba, trying to build a revolution across the continent, emanating from Cuba. And actually, by the time he was writing the novel, there were already the first kind of critical voices of whether the Cuban Revolution was actually going to be successful, or whether it was actually becoming too sectarian, right?
Wasn't that the time, and correct me if I'm wrong on my history here, I might be, but wasn't that the time when Castro sent out Che Guevara to kind of go out?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
So,
okay. Yeah.
So Che Guevara actually died that year, right? 1960. Yeah. And many people close to the revolution, as well as people observing the revolution from outside, actually thought that with the departure of Che Guevara from Cuba, that marked a before and after in the future of the revolution. And Che Guevara explicitly said that he was not equipped to build what comes after the revolution, but rather to spread the revolution, right? So to keep engaging himself, to use the words I used before, in this act of creative distraction, right?
Yeah.
Coronel Aurelio Buendía didn't have that opportunity, so basically he stepped aside, completely disenchanted by politics, by power, even by leadership, and then he actually went back to alchemy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and we'll talk about it with Ursula. He didn't wind up going back without baggage. Which,
oh yeah, of course, yeah.
And this is the other thing that leaders have to remember, right? And a little off script here, but like you gotta remember as a leader that, and I think this is really clearly laid out in 100 Years of Solitude. You've got to remember that, and I don't cotton much to what Che Guevara might have said or thought, but he's definitely right about that. If you're gonna engage in something, know your strengths and weaknesses. Know your bookends. I can do this and I cannot do that, and be very clear on your bookends, because otherwise you're going to wind up with, I'm going to use the imagery of a U-Haul. You're going to wind up with a U-Haul full of baggage, trying to get back to where you were before, and that's a heavy weight to carry, or a heavy weight to drive back. And you, to paraphrase from another poet, you cannot always go home again. Matter of fact, very often you can't get back there.
Well, I think Che Guevara was killed.
and Che Guevara was killed, exactly. So, I mean, like, there you go. Well, didn't he also go to, again, my historical memory, didn't Castro send him to Algeria to do some things too?
I think, yeah, he was an ambassador of the revolution. I'm not sure if he was in Algeria, but he was certainly part of the Third World Movement. So he was an ambassador of that cause, and he was certainly in Africa and in other parts of Latin America as well as
Yeah.
the United States, certainly.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I want to kind of switch gears back to talk about the Great Father a little bit, and this idea of waking your people up. So something happens, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics of it, but there's this idea of a plague, right, that visits Makanda, and the plague is one where, in essence, people can't sleep. And again, I thought this was absolute genius. They can't sleep, and well, I'm going to read from the book, 100 Years of Solitude, back to the book. In the meantime, through an oversight, Jose Acario Buendia, the Great Father, never forgave himself for the candy animals made in the house that were still being sold in the town. Children and adults sucked with delight on the delicious little green roosters of Insomnia, the exquisite pink fish of Insomnia, and the tender yellow peonies of Insomnia, so that on dawn, Monday, found the whole town awake. This is a one little moment. I'm going to pause on that, but this is one of those moments of like a dreamlike mistake, and you know, the Great Father, is so consumed with alchemy and so consumed with the transmutation of lead into gold, in essence, and every other friggin' thing that comes across his radar. He's literally the most distractible person in the first like third, not even first third, the first 10% of the book. The Great Father is looking everywhere except at what he should be looking at. His focus is everywhere except what it should be on. And this plague of insomnia comes into Makanda, which is one of those snakes in the garden. Now, again, I'm fascinated by movies. And so the movie that Christopher Nolan made a few years ago about the guy who well, not the guy, but like Al Pacino couldn't sleep, insomnia. I'm fascinated by this idea of like, if you stay awake, your brain actually neurologically can't handle it. Like we're built to actually sleep. And then you, at a certain point, I think it's like after 4 days of no sleep, you go past what's called the point of no return. Now, the Navy SEALs will push you. Special Forces training will usually push you. Military training will usually push you past that to see what the limits of your endurance are. And I guess that's fine if you're going to go out and, sneak into rooms and kill people and capture them. I guess that's fine. You might need that. But but if you're leading a Fortune 500 company, you need sleep. That's number one. But also number two, and this is even bigger, you need to be not chasing a bunch of different stuff and stay hyper focused and hyper vigilant on the thing that you need to, and we call it, intentionality over here where we are at, but staying intentional about what it is you're doing and staying really hyper focused there. And when a mistake does get made, and mistakes will get made, dysfunctions will show up, toxicity will show up, and he struggled to kind of cure the town of this insomnia. And the only thing that cured the town was making memories. And I thought that was, and the act of writing. And that's another, again, the snake in the garden. But it shows how leaders have to give a skill to replace a pathology sometimes. And I see this in organization after organization after organization after organization. And sometimes leaders are hesitant to give that skill because they want to hold it. It's that ego thing. They want to hold on to it. And he had a touch of that too, right? Like he was like, and it kind of took him a long time to kind of figure out what was going on with the folks in the town, because his ego and his self-interest and his shame, quite frankly, and his guilt over unleashing this plague wouldn't let him see it. And he woke his folks up. And that stepped away, that was one of the first few steps, the first few tottering steps that pushed Makanda away from myth into the reality of civilization, into what is, notoriously talked about, these days as a new normal. I hate that term. So thoughts on that? I mean, I dumped a bunch of different stuff in the pot there, but like this idea of like waking your people up, and trying to correct a mistake after you've been distracted as a leader. You're the one, it was your fault, and now you've got to fix it. I
think that this quote is actually a very great example of how great books are great because they have multiple lives,
Yeah.
and the passage that you read uh, acquires a completely new meaning after the situation that we're still in, which is the pandemic, right?
Right.
And I think this is also another powerful reminder of great books as paper leaders. Why? Because as soon as the pandemic started, this novel, among others, was a book that people were actually turning to in order to make sense of what was actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
As if literally people were asking the book, please talk to me, tell me how to make sense of this pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were, thousands of readers around the world, they were actually now reading this passage of the plague of insomnia with a lot of detail because they were trying to figure out especially how to make sense of their current situation through the what was going on in the novel, not only to find maybe comfort and understanding, but also to make predictions about what the world would be
Hmm.
or would look like after we all wake up again to that term that we all hate, the new normal, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's interesting when hesitate to call it the plague, the pandemic broke out. I was reading the Decameron, which yeah,
Yeah, there
and
is another.
so
Yeah, there's
yeah.
also a plague there.
Oh my gosh, yes, and um, the thing that struck me, 3 cycles of bubonic plague just rolled through Europe in 130 years. I mean, just roughly in those 3 cycles. Carted off a ton of folks, and I'm not diminishing those deaths. I mean,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was a
but
lot of people,
millions.
millions. Um, and we don't. I'm going to say something terrible out loud. I'm going to mark it here. This is the terrible thing I'm about to say. That's that's creative destruction at a human level because
Mm-hmm.
the economy of Europe, the ways in which people chose to engage with the world economically, and they didn't have that word, but the way they chose to do that, those old ways got swept away.
Mm-hmm.
And it is arguable, and I've seen it written in several places, that if those 3 cycles of the bubonic plague had not occurred, that are talked about in the Decameron and they're subtly referenced in Canterbury Tales, another book that we'll talk about here on the podcast a little bit
Wonderful.
down the road. If those hadn't happened, there's the potential that America never would have been discovered. Ships would have never been built because
Mm-hmm.
the shipbuilding business was not a business at that time. Like, they had no reason to leave. Now we can assert that because discovery and exploration is an
Yeah.
inherently damaging process. We can assert that, well, maybe it would have been better if they never
Mm-hmm.
left.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? You don't get to. I gotta be careful when I say this. You don't get to critique the history you wanted. You just get to deal with the history you got.
Yeah, that's right. Although, and I'm also guilty of that that pleasure, which is the pleasure of counterfactual
Mm-hmm.
reasoning. And this is actually one of the things that I do in my book, by the way, which is actually to think, okay, well, so in my book, I write the history of how 100 of Solitude was written and became a global classic. But as I was writing the book, I was also interrogating myself about other books that would have become great books.
Mm-hmm.
They could have become, paper leaders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And did not. And why was the case? So I think that counterfactual analysis is a very powerful tool. But when done with correct form of analysis, and I think that it is true that some people have argued that even thanks to the bubonic plague, the DNA of Europeans has been more resistant to some of the COVID-19 variants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I have not seen a conclusive analysis on that, but that was actually one of the hypotheses on the table. So I think that, counterfactual analysis is something that I like, but again, we need to be careful. And I think that, going back to the novel, there is a lot of counterfactual questions that we can ask ourselves For instance, had Aureliano Buendía, had he won the war, would have he become like the typical Latin American dictator, or would have actually become like a wise leader, right? So that was actually something that Garcia Marquez himself was thinking about as he was writing the novel, because in a very early draft of the novel, actually Colonel Buendía won the war, and his family actually grabbed power. But then he detached the victory from the novel. So then Colonel Aureliano Buendía becomes a loser, because I think Garcia Marquez thought that it was, there were more lessons to be learned about leadership and power and solitude by portraying Coronel Aureliano Buendía as a loser than as a winner of the revolution.
Yeah. Well, let's read from the book about Colonel Aureliano Buendía and in his uprisings. So back to the book, 100 Years of Solitude. Colonel Aureliano Buendía organized 32. I love this entire paragraph.
That's one of the great paragraphs.
Great paragraph. 32 armed uprisings, and he lost them all. Again, it's that Latin irony. And I'm sure it sounds way better in the original Spanish, which if I could read it, I would love that.
Let me tell you something real quick. Garcia Marquez himself thought that the translation into English by Gregory Rabassa was a masterpiece.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Garcia Marquez liked to exaggerate, and he actually said that the book, it's even better in English than in Spanish. I mean, he was exaggerating a little bit, but he really wanted to praise Rabassa for a masterful translation, and I must say that it is a masterful translation.
Yeah. Okay. He had 17 male children by 17 different women. That's the baggage part I was referencing earlier. And they were exterminated one after the other on a single night before the oldest had reached the age of 35. He survived 14 attempts on his life, 73 ambushes, and a firing squad. By the way, in the African American community, they call that guy a thug. That's what they call that guy. That's the term they lay on that dude. He lived through a dose of strychnine in his coffee that was enough to kill a horse. By the way, there's an entirely great thing in there in the book about in 100 Years of Solitude about that. I love that. He refused the Order of Merit, which the President of the Republic ordered him. He rose to be commander-in-chief of the revolutionary forces with jurisdiction, and commanded from one border to the other, and the man most feared by the government, but he never let himself be photographed. By the way, that goes back to the idea of the daguerreotype, right? And calling that back.
And today, like, leaders are over photographed. I think it's just.
We've gone around. We went around. We went 180 to the other side on that.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, if you're not photographed on Instagram, you can't be a true revolutionary. He declined the lifetime pension offered him after the war, and until old age, he made his living from the little gold fishes that he manufactured in his workshop in Macondo. Although he always fought at the head of his men, the only wound that he received was the one that he gave himself after signing the Treaty of Neerlandia, which put an end to almost 20 years of civil war. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol, and the bullet came out through his back without damaging any vital organ. The only thing left of all that was a street that bore his name in Macondo. And yet, as he declared a few years before he died of old age, he had not expected any of that on the dawn he left with his 21 men to join the forces of General Victorio Medina. "We'll leave Macondo in your care," was all that he said to Arcadio, his younger brother, before leaving. "We leave it to you in good shape. Try to have it in better shape when we return." Now, the younger brother, let me riff a little bit off of that. Now, if I remember correctly, this is the brother that was the wild man who went away and came back. Yes, on the ship, right?
Yeah.
He turned out to be a tyrant. He turned out to be not a great leader at all. He had the tendency of his father to kind of ignore the small things, take what he wanted, in the case of land and title, which was not his, and then hunt on that land and basically disintermediated, a modern word, people who lived on that land and basically took resources from them. And then this is the brother, right, that mysteriously wound up getting shot, and like the wife that,
That's
and
right.
then Amarada declined. And I'm not talking about the wives right now, although these folks have wives and children and they have entire lives. And Marquez did an excellent job of building entire mythology, right? So it's not just these men that we're talking about. It's also their entire mythology around them. And we're going to get to Ursula here in just a second. I'm going to open the door to that. I want to have a conversation about her because there are women involved in this process as well that are hugely impactful. But, he left behind a person who was engaged in the dark triad of leadership, right? Narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. I mean, the brother had all of that. And, it was also kind of examined and kind of pushed in the kernel, where he was moving from being a man of intellect to being a man of action. And so he kind of intellected himself through all that, but Arcadio didn't. He just was full on wild man, brute beast. And of course, this entire paragraph, which is in chapter, I think, it's either 7 or 8 of the book. If I remember correctly, you'll remind me.
Yeah, I don't remember it, but it's somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Somewhere in the middle, yeah. References back to and refers back to it, and this is how Marquez structured the book. And I want to talk a little about the structure of 100 Years of Solitude too, because the structure is genius. You have to actually pay attention to what's going on in the book. Like, you can't just like read it and then go watch Netflix for like 4 hours, then come back and expect to pick it up. You have to actually pay attention to what he's doing, because he references back to the first line, which is the iconic line, in the book, that where I first, ran across this book, which was in Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, her memoir, which we will cover on this podcast in January. We're going to talk about Joan Didion, and we're going to counterbalance her with Ernest Hemingway and Movable Feast. So we're going to talk about both of those and the power of the memoir for leaders.
Great books.
Oh, I love Movable Feast. I read it once a year, almost every year since I was like 8 years old. I love that book. I'm a huge Hemingway guy.
Yeah. Well, so was Garcia Marquez, by the way. Yeah. As you know.
There you go. So there you go. But it references back to that first line. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. And he survived the firing squad. But you don't know that when you read that first book. You also don't know that he's got, some narcissistic psychopathic traits, and that his brother is even worse. How much did Marquez intentionally weave this in, and how much in the structure of the book was this just taken over, by him? That's I guess my first question. And my second question is, what does this say about leading through the dark arts? Because I'm going to have somebody come on in another couple of episodes. We're going to talk about the Prince. We're going to talk about Machiavelli, and we're going to talk about the Dark Triad. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So the first question is more about how much was Garcia Marquez doing what specifically?
Yeah, intentional about layering and world building in this kind of way. Like I know Stephen King has talked about, and I have his book on writing. He's talked about how he's not that intentional. Like the characters just kind of like in Tommy Knockers.
Yeah, I think
he wrote while he was on cocaine.
Yeah,
so he's like, ignore that book. But he's like, the book just kind of took me, right? It took me where I wanted to go. Or the Dark Tower series, which I love. The books have just taken me where I wanted to go. They almost write themselves. But then you have other authors who are extremely intentional about how they put together their books.
Yeah.
Was Marquez intentional, or did he just kind of let the story take him?
Well, I think that the answer is both, and let me explain why. So he had the idea for the book like 17 years before, and he was really maturing that idea for the novel all those years. And in the middle, he wrote other novels and other short stories, right? So he was really obsessed with writing a novel in which, as he put it, everything would happen, right? So a novel in which he could really tell from beginning to end the story of Macondo and the Buendia family. So that was certainly very intentional. The problem was that he was not completely sure about how to write it. So it took him a really long time to figure out how to write it. And in the process, for instance, he actually thought about maybe he could write it kind of the Hemingway way, right? So like more with more economic language, more direct, more journalistic, right? So the paragraph which you just read about the uprising, that's very Hemingway, because it looks like a piece of reportage, journalism, which Garcia Marquez was drawn to journalism partly because of his love of Hemingway, and also because it was the easiest way to make money and also be a potential professional writer, right? But then there is certainly that moment that when in Mexico City in 1965, when he thought, okay, I got it now. Then he sat down, he started writing, and then the story was literally like going super fast. So in a way, and something I was explaining in my book. So he was actually writing the manuscript, but at the same time, kind of next to him, he actually kept like notebooks, like school notebooks, in which he was actually writing what was going to happen, like 2 chapters, 3 chapters on the road, because the novel was really taking him. It was really going really fast, and he wanted to make sure that he was not losing control, or he was not. So he kept the story under control as he was writing it, but at the same time, he wanted to make sure where the story was going. So he was basically kind of writing 2 documents, like the path that he still had to travel, and then the path that he was already traveling, right? Nice. And that's the reason why it was a combination of both, intentional and also completely almost automatic, right? Which is writing and writing and writing.
Well, and writers and creatives in general get captured by the thing that they do.
Absolutely.
And that's the power of the arts, right? That's why this podcast is focused on literature and leadership and business. Like we're trying to find the intersections between all of those areas, because fundamentally leaders should get captured by leadership. They should get captured by these acts, because that's their art. In the same way that if I'm making a print, I get captured by the moment of making a print. If I am drawing a picture and I'm really I'm in a flow state, an optimal state of mind, I get captured by that. If I'm writing, I get captured by that, right? And folks who are doing it at the highest level get captured at the highest level.
And I think, and there is also, think about lessons for leadership. I think one of the hardest tasks for a leader, because when you're writing a book, you're basically dealing with yourself, right? So, and with your levels of energy and stamina, but keeping that momentum that is necessary to lead and to get people on board, and to infect them with enthusiasm. That's really hard. And I think that one of the untold stories about the writing of this novel is that when we're actually thinking about true genius, the reality is that Garcia Marquez surrounding himself with people who were friends, relatives, and colleagues who were constantly checking on him, and he was also kind of giving them information about how the novel was going, right? So, and I think that was wonderful for him to really maintain that level of enthusiasm and energy that was necessary, because you can be in trance while making something small, a print, like taking photos. So we can all achieve that kind of what psychologists call like flow, in which we're really taking about that. Your brain is actually, it seems to be, is supposed to be working harder, but it's actually working less, consumes less energy, right? So, but keeping that going when you're actually writing something like a novel or a book, or you're, painting something, or you are like literally creating a startup, that's the kind of, that entails, a level of, stamina and energy and collective support that it's rare to find. So that's one of the reasons why, we don't see Amazons created every day. We don't see, Obamas emerging every day, and we don't see 100 Years of Solitude emerging every single year, right? Because, you really need to have a very powerful combination of factors going on, right?
Well, and you also have to have, and you talked about how, he started in journalism because he wanted to kind of, reportage space, kind of similar to Hemingway. You know, it's going to also pay me some money because, you know, I could be a great writer, but I got to eat too, and I got to pay the bills. Like I got to live in this world, right? You know, so, you know, and he worked on his craft for years, right?
That's right.
And this is the other thing. Very often we don't look too deeply at the work that, and it drives me absolutely crazy, the work that a leader does. Like when I first started, you know, my business 8 years ago now, that this podcast is nested under, I mean, you know, somebody told me that, you know, it was going to take me 10, and I do, you know, videos on this all the time, and she was right. It's going to take you 10 years to become an overnight success. And for that 10 years, no one's going to care like what you were doing or what you were achieving. You're going to, and what she was saying in essence was, it's going to take you 10 years to get to mastery and competency. It's going to take you 10 years to get to a place where you're so good you can now enter the flow state because you've worked through the gut-wrenching parts that you have to actually be intentional about. And for leaders, it's the same thing. Like, and this is why it drives us crazy. This is why we do leadership training, because leadership training kind of shortcuts that a little bit. But it also is a thing that irons out all that gutting up the mountain of the bad parts, right?
Yeah,
you know?
that's right. And you need to be careful with that. Yeah, because
exactly.
I think that, you know, true leaders are really hardworking people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think that sometimes, you know, as you said, you know, we look at the right side of things and we forget about, you know, kind of the nasty parts, or, you know, or the travel through the desert, you know, which, you know, that travel, that trip, as you said, can last many years. And I think this is probably one of the things I admire the most of Garcia Marquez as a writer. He was someone who knew he had a talent, and he could have, like, literally, he could have thrown the towel many times, but he was confident, and he knew that you know, he wanted to share something with the world, and he succeeded. But you know, getting there and getting up to the level that he was skillful enough to tell the story that he wanted to tell, you know, it took him like 17 years, you know.
There you go.
And then 14 months of hard work in which, you know, his family was suffering because he had to live on credit. And so, you know, and I don't think that you know, many people are willing to make the sacrifice. And I think having the ability to sacrifice for something you truly believe in, I think it's also one of the trademarks of true leaders, right?
Yeah. Well, it's and that's why I say, you know, leaders are artists. You know, I got a Van Gogh behind me. Leaders are artists. You know, it's not an accident. Well, you talk about the nasty parts. Okay, so let's switch to Arcadio. You know, the brother, the wild man, the brute who was left in charge. Let's talk a little bit about his story for a couple moments. He was not a good man. Let's just say that. And Marquez tries to tie that back to upbringing, which is an interesting psychological kind of twist. But I thought of it in the mythological sense, like, you know, the great father has 3 sons, which makes sense. That goes along with the triune kind of idea. That makes sense. And each son represents a certain aspect of the father's personality. That goes along. That makes sense. We see that tracking. And, you know, the father has to instantiate his darkness into one of the sons. And it was Arcadio. That was the son where that darkness got instantiated into him. But it didn't manifest until his brother said, just leave. I love the line, and you know, I want to go back to it. Like, I love this line. You know, he says, we leave Macondo in your care, was all that he said to Arcadio before leaving. We leave it to you in good shape. Try to have it in better shape when we return. Arcadio was a dark guy. The colonel was blind to that. I think leaders have to make make sure that whoever they leave in charge, whoever they give their succession to, whoever they give their legacy to, actually is worthy of that legacy.
Yeah, and that's one of the hardest decisions, because it's about you need to find the balance between choosing someone who is similar to you, but at the same time, if you want the company, or you want the city, Macondo, to evolve, you also need to find a person, other things that you don't have, that eventually would make the city or the company that you're leaving behind better, right? And as you were actually talking about that, the example that came to mind is like Steve Jobs and Tim Cook.
Yep.
And I think that's an example of a very successful transition in leadership. But of course, that's rare. Think about how many big companies had.
Well, I was talking with somebody the other day about
right now,
Microsoft and Ballmer,
or Amazon, right?
Or Amazon, yeah.
So
like who knows what Amazon is going to be? Like, Jeff Bezos was at the head of that ship for almost 25 years. One man, one vision, 25 years. Who knows what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
You saw this, as I was just saying. Have a conversation with somebody the other day about Microsoft and Ballmer, and this was a person who actually had worked with Steve Ballmer quite closely, and had worked with Bill Gates quite closely. And he's like, dude was okay. Yeah, everything that you saw from the outside, it was more ridiculous inside. And and this is going to be terrible, but Steve Jobs did Tim Cook a favor by dying.
Yeah,
because he took himself off the table. Because if not, I don't know that Tim Cook could have been as effective with the shadow of Steve Jobs running around in the world. Because there was no way that Steve was just going to, retire from Apple and then just leave. If Steve had lived another 50 years, where else was he going to go?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely critical, right? So leaders do need to make good choices. If they do really care about their legacy, they really need to make good choices. And Aurelio Buendia made a mistake when he left the management of the city in the hands of the Arcadio, not just Arcadio, but the Arcadio side of the family, which is more destructive. Whereas right, at least within Macondo, right, or inside Macondo.
Yeah. Well, okay. We've been kind of wandering around her. Let's talk about Ursula. We've been kind of wandering around her. Females have have the same and different issues, problems, concerns in leadership than men do. They have the same and they have different. Similarities include, how do we lead? How do we inspire a shared vision? How do we create an effective role modeling culture? How do we, leave somebody behind who's worthy of our legacy? Those are similar to men. But there are very specific differences. And those specific differences have to do with how women are perceived in culture, how women incorporate and instantiate shame, for making decisions, how they are gendered differently around success and failure, and what does that mean? And of course, I'm going to borrow from my favorite feminist, Camille Paglia. They are bound by the structures and boundaries of society, and yet here's the thing that Camille Paglia would say: they burst out all over. And they can't help it. And Ursula is an example of this. She was written with all of the weight of this is what's on Latin American women that's placed upon them by Latin American men. She was written with all that. You can sense all of that weight, and yet she bursts through in the text. She's the one that takes care of the Great Father when he's underneath the chestnut tree, just declining. She's the one who faces the revolution and even faces her own son ultimately and says, no, this is the line you're not going to pass. She's the one who, in an interesting element at the beginning of the book, kind of just wanders away and then just comes back with no explanation. And
that's right.
There's this giant, it's like a parenthesis and you don't get any explanation of what happened in the parentheses.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you never really know where she was, what she
Right,
was doing.
exactly.
Yeah, but you can see that when that happened, so I think this is a beautiful way in which we can think about leadership, right? So, all the energy that Jose Arcadio, when the patriarch had,
Mm,
he realized that a lot of the energy, enthusiasm, stamina, ideas came from being next to Ursula, right? So
mm,
from having her support. So then, there's a beautiful passage in the book where it says that when Ursula disappeared, then Jose Arcadio was like, he felt lost,
mm,
depressed,
mm,
like he didn't know. And then when she came back, she was puzzled, but deep inside, he was like very happy that she was back because
mm.
he realized how much he needed her, right? And I think that speaks a lot about the importance of Ursula as a character in the novel, because a lot we have been talking a lot about Aureliano and Jose Arcadio, and the male characters. But what is truly unique, and it's often not seen, is that Macondo really started to collapse, and the family started to collapse when Ursula died.
Yes.
She dies in a very funny way, by the way. But when Ursula disappears from the novel, then one of Solitude starts to end, and I think it is because she's really the pillar of the book, right? So she's there from the beginning, and she's there until the very end, and then she exits the novel, and then the novel ends, the city ends, and the family ends, right?
Well, it's that. We don't like to talk about it too much, and I'm going to go a little anthropological here to make this next point. But we don't like to talk about it too much in the world. But it is true. Culture matters, and there's not going to be. Well, people are through entertainment and other means trying to create an environment of a global monoculture, right? Where you're on Instagram, I'm on Instagram. Um, you know, some kid in Alaska is on Instagram, some kid in Russia is on Instagram, and we're all on Instagram together. And isn't it great? We're all, and they're trying to create this monoculture based on technology, which is cool and interesting, I guess. But your local culture still matters. And then from there, your nation state culture still matters. And if you want to go even deeper than that, your tribal culture matters. There are still tribes in various parts of India and China and South Africa, or not South Africa, sorry, the African continent and the South American continent, where tribalism still matters. Your tribal language still matters. And the feminine, and this is where I'm going to connect this to Ursula, how the feminine is perceived in those cultural contexts matters. So the feminine is perceived differently in an Anglo-Saxon context, which is kind of what America was founded on. Not kind of, it was what America was founded on. In an Anglo-Saxon context, it's totally different. But now that breaks down in subcultures in the United States, because how African American women perceive and are perceived in their feminine energy is different, quite frankly. Let's just be blunt here. It's different than how Caucasian women are perceived, and it's different than Asian women. And that breaks down along culture. And so the thing that I sensed from Ursula is you're talking about that feminine energy, was it was definitely a culturally ascribed feminine energy.
Oh yeah.
And culturally bound feminine energy. And I'm sure there's a feminist critique to Garcia Marquez.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sure there is.
Yeah. Because his female characters are, see, he has received a lot of pushback from not just feminists, but also from critical readers of his work, because maybe while they may acknowledge that Ursula was a female leader, at the same time, she also reproduced some of the stereotypes about Latin femininity that many women right now are actually trying to overcome in Latin America, because they feel that the perpetuation of these stereotypes ultimately don't allow them to be not just female leaders, but but leaders at large, without the kind of the gender adjective, like the female at the beginning, but just leaders without, a gender packaging there.
Yeah, a gender construct around them. Yeah. Well, and you know what? I mean, hey, they may have something there, and again, that's a very specific, I don't know, that's a very specific critique, to
Mm-hmm.
that specific culture. And again,
Mm-hmm.
culture matters, right?
Absolutely.
And you can, and culture is defined by language and customs and traditions and all of those kinds of things that are unconsciously held. And to tie this back to leadership, as you've been saying, if your organizational culture, I'm looking at the company that did the Bumble IPO, I'm looking at you now.
Mm-hmm.
If your culture is led by a woman, fundamentally there's going to be a different, not only energy there, but there's going to be a different yet similar focus on these elements of leadership. How do we lead through conflict? The things we've been talking about today. How do we lead through conflict? How do we concretize the myth of this company, this organization, this culture into some stantiated reality that people can hold on to? How do we do that? That's going to be driven by that energy, and it's going to look different.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and it's going
and
to
I
be
think,
great.
yeah, and I think that's also the reason why I truly believe that we need more diversity in leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because there what we're now seeing as there's more diversity in leadership is that we actually see there are multiple paths to effective and successful leadership, right?
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. I've had a great time talking here today. I think we have to close.
Yeah,
We
I
haven't
think we
even
can.
broken down a tenth of 100 years of solitude, but hopefully we've given folks enough to be able to A, go out and grab a copy of the book, B, grab a hold of it from a leadership perspective, but also from a literature perspective, and really appreciate it. Its depth, I keep going back to this idea of its weight, but also applying its power to what you want to accomplish as a leader in your organization, whether it's a small business, a medium-sized business, or maybe you're running a nonprofit. Whatever it is you want to do, go and look at this book and highlight it, underline it, uh, and pick which parts resonate with you, and engage around it. So, um, I guess in closing, there are several points to be made about 100 Years of Solitude, and most of them are made by people smarter than me, including Dr. Alvaro Santana Acuna today on our podcast. Guy's a genius. Go read his book Ascent. Go take a look at the Gabriel Garcia Marquez papers at the Henry Ransom Center. And he's going to talk a little bit about that. Go take a look at the work this man's doing. He's pulling apart, the work, and he's engaging with this novel contextually, and it's amazing. This great Latin American novel sits at the top of the apex of books ever written because it hits on archetypes of the Great Father, which we talked about today, the Great Mother, which we just finished talking about, wayward sons, and even, we didn't talk about them, but wayward daughters. 100 Years of Solitude can be read and absorbed solipsistically and framed as just another magical book, and there will be people who will do that. I've read the comments online. I know who you are. But it would be a wrong conclusion to draw. It would be a wrong set of conclusions to draw from this book. Leaders have to understand the power of myth and stories and the ways in which those myths and stories can drive their followers to act. Leaders have to know when to beat their swords into plowshares and make war no more. And I'm not the first person to say that, by the way, lest they lapse into meaningless conflict without end. Leaders must have a plan, an intentional plan, I would assert, to move their ideas, their carefully crafted visions, and their passions from myth into reality. And then they must make the move back to myth again in order to revivify their followers and renew their purpose, lest they risk becoming an ossified great father or a tyrannical mother, immovable, concretized, and at the end of all things, which this is some imagery from the book, decaying into a pile of beautiful yellow flowers that'll just float away, as the generations will do out ahead of them across long expanse of time. All right, anyway, that's it for me. Alvaro, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, well, I just want to thank you again, Jason, for having me. It has been great. And also, I want to encourage the listeners of your podcast to keep engaging with great books. I think that, one of the lessons to be learned from great books is that there are paper leaders, right? So they really, we're always going to be in good company with a great book in our hands. And I think that, 100 of Solitude is one of these books. And as we have tried to do today, to show that the multiple dimensions that you can explore this book. And certainly, if you want to know more about how actually Garcia Marquez wrote this book and why we're actually, talking about it in this podcast, so why it has become such a global classic, of course you can read my book Ascent to Glory. And also, if you happen to be in Austin before the end of the year, I certainly invite you to go to this great show that we put together at the Harry Ramson Center, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Making of a Global Writer, in which, if you also happen to love literature, you will also see the works of Garcia Marquez, along with manuscripts of James Joyce's Ulysses, which I think is going to be also in this podcast, Hemingway, who we also talked about, Virginia Woolf, Jorge Luis Borges, Julio Cortázar. So it's really a wonderful show. So if you have a chance to visit it, please do so. So thank you again, Jason.
Awesome. And thank you once again for coming on our podcast, Dr. Acuna. Again, we will have links in the show notes to everything that he just talked about. We'll have links to his book. We'll have links to the exhibit, to the and to every place else that he's been on the internet. So go click on those links and stay on the path. If you want to connect with me, obviously, you can connect with me on the HSCT Publishing website at hsctpublishing.com. We offer leadership training, customized webinars, our leadership toolbox process, and our 3 pillars product to help executive leaders become less ossified as great fathers or great mothers in their organizations. We have our Leading Keys solution, a platform designed for long-term care, although we will be expanding it in January of 2022 to a general audience, designed to help leaders come and get digital support and digital help, because maybe you don't always want to go to a training and maybe your organization can't send you. So check us out at leadingkeys.com. I've got a couple of books out there. My latest book is called My Boss Doesn't Care. So go ahead and check that out on Amazon.com. It's a little red book. Yes, I know the revolutionary overtones there. It's a little red book. It's called My Boss Doesn't Care. 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss. Go ahead and check that out on Amazon.com, a collection of my thoughts. Upcoming book is going to be 12 Rules for Leaders, a foundation for intentional leadership, coming out in April of 2022. There are promo videos floating around, and if you would like to join the pre-order list, send me an email, ceo@hsconsultingandtraining.com, and I will add you to the pre-order list. That will entitle you to attending special events and doing a whole bunch of other different fun stuff with us as we lead up to the launch of this book, including potentially maybe even being featured on this podcast. If you'd like to book me, if you'd like to have me speak at a conference or at an event, or if you'd like to have me come on your podcast and talk a little bit about my podcast or my book or any of the other things that we are involved in at HSCT Publishing, please connect with me at jesansorrells.com. And of course, you can check out my other 2 podcasts, Jesan Sorrells Audio Experience and the Earbud U podcast. And of course, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. We will have a video version of our podcast today on the HSCT Publishing website underneath Leadership Lessons from the Great Books Podcast playlist. So please go and subscribe to that playlist. We currently have up Meditations, the Book of Nehemiah, and of course, a 2,500-year-old book called The Iliad, which we have also talked about. All right, that's it. Stay on the path. I'm out.